Ka tīmata tātou, nā te mea, ngā mihi atu ki a koutou katoa kua tai mai I tēnei ata, I te whakarongo ki ngā rangatira I tēnei ata, a tā Kim Woodman me te whaia Julia Ioane. Nā te mea, koutou mea, ko Lisa McNab tōku ingoa, no te hiku o te ika, kua hau te hemana o tēnei wāhanga. Ka tīmata tātou I raro I te koro ai o te atua, nō reira tēnā tātou. Mā te haumahana o te kāhui o te rangi. Me te wairua o ngā tūpuna, tātou I tiaki tātou, I manaki I ngā wā katoa. Ai o ki te rangi, ai o ki te whenua, ai o ki ngā mea katoa, tihei wā Māori ora. Nō reira, tēnā tātou anō. Welcome everyone, welcome to this session of lifting the veil of silence on racism within the criminal justice sector. Like to welcome Tā Kim Woodman and Whaia Professor Julia Ioane, and welcome the 168 participants who have joined us this morning. No pressure, you two, but you have double that amount of ears listening to you both this morning. Great to welcome you both. Now, I'm not going to take up any more of your time, but to say welcome, and to all of those who have joined us this morning. There is at the top of the chat list both Tā's bio and Whaia Julia's bio. So if you're not quite sure on their magic mahi that they're doing, please just have a look at the top of the chat. So I'm going to hand over straight to you, Tā Kim, and say again, welcome. Great to have you and Whaia Julia on session this morning. Nō reira, tēnā koe, tēnā kōrua. You're on mute, Tā.
Kia ora. Tēnā koutou ki ngā tangata e huhu mai nei. Ko taki timu te waka, ko wairarapa te moana, ko tararua ngā maunga, ko kahununu ki wairarapa me rangitāne, ko wairarapa o ku iwi, ko Ngāti hine waka me Ngāti moe o ku hapu, ko kohunui me pāpāwai o ku marae, ko Kim Workman tōku ingoa. All right, it's a great honour and privilege to be here. Last week, Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern and Ministers Kelvin Davis, Jan Tinetti and Aotearoa William Shiok launched the Aotearoa New Zealand History's curriculum Te Tikanga o Te Wā at Sylvia Park School. History lessons are expected to include the arrival of Māori, early colonisation, the Treaty of Waitangi, and the evolving identity of our nation. It's a history that for many years has been hidden from our mokopuna, hidden beneath a veil of silence. This morning I want to talk about a tiny but significant part of that history, the role of the criminal justice system in colonisation and the perpetuation of systemic racism within the system. A close examination of police history in New Zealand shows primary reliance on a policing style common to all colonising nations. Colonial police forces were not created to maintain public peace, to wage a war on crime, or to engage in community crime prevention, and certainly not to become guardians of public safety. They were created by the state as agencies of social control to impose the will of the state upon unwilling subjects. It was an overtly political role supporting and enforcing the coercive control of the indigenous population. It would be misguided, for example, to believe that the purpose of imprisonment is and always has been the same for Māori and non-Māori. In addition to the usual reasons for imprisoning citizens, the 19th century view was that the imposition of British law and penal policy on Māori would expedite the process of assimilation by preparing Māori for British citizenship. Second, it was a means of denying Māori the right to punish and correct according to their own traditions and tikanga. Third, the imprisonment and arbitrary detention of entire whānau, men, women, and children, was a key strategy for dealing with Māori who resisted the unlawful actions of the state and who were perceived by the state as comprising a dangerous underclass or being in rebellion to the state. From 1845 onwards, the colonial government took the view that the welfare of Māori was best achieved through forcing the abandonment of our own customs in favour of English law and the adoption of European skills and knowledge. The saving of the Māori race necessarily involved the extinction of Māori culture. The attitude of settlers and social commentators of the day was that Māori did not have any system of law. Wakefield summed it up this way: if you were asked for a summary definition of a contrast between barbarism and civilization, you would not err in saying that the civilized men differ from savages in having their natural inclinations restrained by law, honor, and religion. The colonial policing style dominated from the establishment of the armed police force in 1856 through to the separation of the police and military into the permanent militia and the New Zealand Police Force in 1886 and beyond. While the military influence abated, the characteristics and style of colonial policing did not entirely disappear, but lay inert, ready to be resurrected at the first sign of perceived Māori resistance. Māori see whakapapa connections that others might not. The 1881 Parihaka incident was one of the worst infringements of civil and human rights ever committed and witnessed in New Zealand. In 1916, the police raided Ruakinana's Wairua Tapu movement at Maunga Pohatu, killing 3 members after the gathered faith community were depicted as criminal by government officials. The 2007 Operation 8 raids, when residents in the small Māori township of Rātoki were searched by armed police who boarded a bus carrying young children. The police and the government, to their credit, have apologized for their actions in all 3 cases. But coercive policing has survived the establishment of an unarmed police and remained as a response to perceived Māori resistance or unlawfulness to this day. The recent establishment of police armed response teams to target 4 marginalized communities unleashed strong criticism from both Māori and the general public. resulting in a claim to the Waitangi Tribunal and a subsequent decision by the new commissioner, Andy Costa, to abandon the trial. Let me share my own experience with you, not as a consumer of the criminal justice system, but as a collaborator. I joined the police in 1958. And between 1960 and 1972, the government abandoned Māori land development schemes in rural areas, pressured Māori to sell their homes, Europeanized Māori land titles, and offered one-way fares to move to the city. The housing provided was deliberately pepper-potted so that as far as possible, Māori families had no immediate Māori neighbours and no Māori communal facilities were built in the new suburbs. All legislation was reviewed to ensure that existing instances of differentiation between Māori and Europeans were eliminated. While the government's stated intention was to promote equality for all, equality was achieved on Pākehā terms. The world was rapidly changing. In 1945, 26% of Māori were living in urban areas. By 1966, that had increased to 62%. It was the most rapid urbanization of an indigenous population anywhere in the world. Māori were living in a strange and new urban world, and behavior they considered normal in a Māori environment was considered threatening and potentially dangerous by Pākehā. At the same time, the police culture was undergoing a reform of its own. I recall that we were not encouraged to exercise discretion, take risks, or be innovative. Our job was to fight crime, and the most obvious measure of that was a high offender arrest and conviction rate. It didn't take much for a lock-em-up culture to evolve. The large number of police on the streets and the lack of efficient communication technology meant that police officers were largely unsupervised. It was not uncommon for a mobile patrol to pick up a couple of policemen off the street and, knowing there was safety in numbers, go looking for trouble. Cars of young people would be routinely stopped and checked. Any protest or resistance from the victims was likely to lead to confrontation and trumped up charges. Obstructing the police, obscene language, or resisting arrest were common. Some police sergeants actively ramped up young constables to make arrests, and young policemen competed with each other to see how many arrests they could make over an 8-hour shift. Groups of young Māori workers were disproportionately the target of attention and were more likely to be interrogated by the police than Pākehā. Their inhibited and boisterous behaviour, unrestrained laughter, impromptu singing, and preparedness to engage in witty repartee with the police irritated members of the police, who responded by targeting them for special attention. Between 1954 and 1958, reported Māori youth offending rose by 50%. One of the factors that caused this increase related not to how Māori behaved in this strange and new urban world, but how they were treated by non-Māori. Māori urban migrants were perceived and treated as a potentially dangerous underclass. They were outsiders. Excuse me. What was the downstream impact of all this on Māori within the criminal justice system? The 1962 Hun report confirmed that Māori were more likely to be imprisoned, sent to borstal, or placed on probation, less likely to have court cases dismissed than non-Māori, and more likely to be committed to the Supreme Court for trial. Most Māori came to court with no idea how to plead or defend themselves. About 80% of Māori were not represented by counsel, compared to 60% of Pākehā. And about 80 to 85% of Māori pleaded guilty, compared to 60% of Europeans. In 1972, I was a police youth aid officer and began visiting Kohitere institution at Levin, an institution for boys aged 14 to 15. There were 110 boys in residence. On my first visit, the impact of what we were doing hit me. I was met with a sea of brown faces. Of the 110 boys in the institution, about 90% were either Māori or Pacific. The place was a hellhole. Research since confirms that these children and young people endured physical, sexual, and psychological violence, as well as secure cells, knockout sedatives, and electroconvulsive therapy. The low number of Māori police officers and social workers in the 1960s and 70s had consequences which reached far beyond initial police Māori contact. The Department of Social Welfare had developed a comprehensive network of foster parents, family homes, and social welfare institutions to accommodate children who were removed from their homes. However, both the police and social workers lacked Māori networks and failed to identify sufficient foster parents within the Māori community. As a result, Māori children were often dealt with by way of formal supervision or removal to an institution, rather than through constructive engagement with their whānau. Those institutions then became a fertile breeding ground for the formation of gangs. But that wasn't all that was happening. Māori first offenders were labelled as criminals on the basis of police dealings with older siblings of the same whānau, or indeed the reputation of the whānau itself, and were more likely to be prosecuted at a young age than Pākehā, even though their offending was not more serious. Offenders were treated as individuals rather than as members of their whānau. Holding hui with whānau to discuss what had happened and work out how to prevent future offending was anathema to most Pākehā police officers who feared losing control of the process. As the supervisory activity of welfare officers grew, more children and families were placed under preventive supervision. By 1971, more than 10,000 families were subject to official oversight. In October 2020, I gave evidence at a public hearing of the Royal Commission of Inquiry into Abuse and Care. When I walked into the anteroom, I was immediately greeted and hugged by two survivors. I had met them both at Kohitere in 1972, and again 18 years later at Puremeremo prison when I was head of prisons. It was an emotional moment. I stayed to hear their evidence, and my thoughts turned to how their lives might have turned out if we had done things differently. The consequences over time of the actions and decisions we make today are significant. By the late 1960s, Māori children were appearing in the court at a rate 3 to 4 times that of Pākehā, and by 1990s, half of all children within the justice system were Māori. When I joined the police, I wondered why there were so few Māori in the police. I wrongly assumed that most Māori would not join an organisation that was almost wholly Pākehā in its makeup and outlook. A closer look revealed some disturbing facts. In 1950, there was only one Māori police officer in the New Zealand police who had joined in 1920. When in the same year, Commissioner Young canvassed his staff about recruiting Māori, he found them almost unanimously opposed. It was not until 1955 that the police directed its recruiting efforts toward Māori. By 1958, when I joined, there were 26 of us in a police force of around 2,500. By 1965, there were 69, or 2.5% of all police. In the same year, 1958, Commissioner Les Spencer declared that Chinese, Hindus, I think he meant Indians, and Pacific Islanders were unsuited to policing and would not be recruited. Apart from Māori, policing should only be done by the white races, as he called them. The police continued to oppose the recruitment of Cook Islanders, who were New Zealand citizens, and other Pacifica people until 1968. It was systemic racism of the most blatant kind. Subsequent governments rejected the policies of integration in the 1970s, and bicultural policies were developed in the 1980s. From 96, under the leadership of Commissioner Peter Doon, the police actively responded to the call for improvement. But the underlying attitudes and bias that underpinned the assimilationist policies prior to the 1970s remain across the public sector and continue to haunt our nation. The police have done probably more than any other criminal justice agency to improve its relationship with Māori. It began with the 1996 responsiveness to Māori strategy, the establishment of iwi liaison officers, of cultural advisory groups, and the support given to iwi crime prevention strategies. Today, 24% of the police are women, 12.3% are Māori, 6.8% are Pacifica, and 6% are Asian. However, those statistics can be deceptive. While there is a far more diverse workforce than was previously the case, it tends to be concentrated in the area of operational activity. Across the criminal justice system, and indeed the public sector, there is a dearth of Māori and Pacifica capacity in such areas as policy development, research and communications. The 2021 Public Service Census tells us that 9.8% of policy analysts are Māori, up marginally from 8.8% in 2012. So in 9 years, there's been a 1% increase. Given that most of them will be concentrated in Māori policy shops, such as Te Tiriti, in most mainstream public sector agencies, the actual percentage in mainstream public sector policy and research groups is very low indeed, and it's very difficult for people to be taken notice of. Within every department, there needs to be Māori expertise, people capable of articulating treaty principles and the collective and individual interests of Māori, including those policies of a strategic nature that relate to Māori as tangata whenua. The challenge, I think, is to have public sector organisations recognise that there would always be Māori interests in the advice offered to government, even if there's no obvious Māori connection. By virtue of the socio-economic status of Māori and the demographic impact that Māori will have on the New Zealand population now and in the future. Racism can manifest itself as both action and inaction in the face of need or differential outcomes. Within the context of the public sector in Aotearoa, systemic racism against Māori is a contemporary breach of Te Tiriti or Waitangi. We still have some distance to travel, but there is hope. A team of wahine Māori public servants recently formed a charitable trust, Te Rauhihiri, to bring issues facing Māori public servants to the forefront. Perhaps this issue will be one of them. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā rā koutou katoa.
Mehe maera, tēnā koutou katoa, kia ora e te tā. Ngā mihi atu ki a koe mo tō kōrero i tēnei ata. Ngā mihi rawe, ngā mihi nunui ki a koe mo tō whakaaro, mo tō āhua, mo tō mahi rangatira i Wainganui tēnā kaupapa. Nō reira e te tā, tēnā koe, tēnā koe, tēnā koe. Look, we've got a couple of 4 questions going up, and the magic of chat in terms of some of the comments being made to your presentation. You know, 60 years of being at the front line of addressing the racism and that has been displayed since the 1800s, all the way through to the 2020s. So, you know, that is an absolute lifetime of being on the front line. So, ngā mihi atu kia koe e te tā. I'm going to leave the questions and now just hand over to kia koe e te maraikura, e te rangatira Julia. Ka hoatu a hau te toko kia koe, mo tō kōrero rangatira. Nō reira tēnā koe talofa, ngā mihi atu kia koe i tēnei wā. Kia ora.
Can you all see that? Okay. Ka tangi te titi, ka tangi te kaka, ka tangi hoki a hauti hei Māori ora. Ko vai te maunga, ko Polynesian Airlines te waka, ko Ngāti Hāmua te iwi, ko tautenga tuwhanua Caressa Foss toku mama, ko Folasāitu tai ngā lala Ioane toku papa, ko Anthony Joseph toku tane, ko Apa Ula Julia Ioane toku ingoa. Whawhtaileang le leia le atua, ma whai on tātou mafutai fo ile nei tai a mātungo fie, tālo whalawa, kia o rana, mālo le lei, Bula vinaka, taloha ni, warm Pacifica greetings to you all. Ngā mihi nui e ngā rangatira, tā Kim Workman. I mean, who wants to follow tā Kim Workman after his kōrero? I was put in that position where I was to go first, and in my culture, respectfully, you never go before your rangatira. And then it was like, well, who wants to go afterwards as well? But I just wanted to just tautoko, tā Kim Workman, thank you for just setting the scene for us this morning, and everything you have said this morning. You know, there's a tinge of sadness and disappointment for me, being in this criminal justice field. You know, a lot more recently than you, and knowing that what you've said, unfortunately, continues to exist. To varying extents within our CJ system. So you've seen my bio, but basically what I wanted to do is just to really come from a cultural, psychological approach, given my background, about looking at racism in terms of just the ideas, practices and material that really are ingrained in just our everyday lifestyles and functioning. And we see that basically really just in our actions and the behaviours and the structures of our everyday world. People live in worlds that promote the way in which we kind of see the world, and then we also, as people, shape, produce and maintain racism through what we prefer, what they practice and how they behave. I think as a psychologist, and what I've seen through some of the overseas literature, it's almost as if, you know, the racism or the biases that exist has kind of gone a bit underground. You know, it's gone a little bit more silent, and we don't see it as obvious as how we used to see it in the past. And the challenge is that if we continue to look at it in terms of an individual level, we do absolutely miss those institutional, those systemic, and those processes that kind of keep those hierarchies and those divisions. So I'm going to just really try and be brief, because I know that there's a lot of questions that you've got, a lot of pathways that you have. I'm going to come from my lived experiences as a profession, as a psychologist. I mean, there's been so many times where I've heard colleagues say to me, you know, I don't see colour in my work, or I've worked for years with, or they'd ring me up to do a consult, and they say, oh, I've worked for years with Māori and Pacifica, so I don't have any problems in working with them. The question is never asked, but do they have a problem, you know, and working with you? Or making the assumption that, you know, a client, you know, saying his English isn't that great, but he doesn't want an interpreter, and that's okay. You know, but actually kind of exploring what's more underlying some of the reasons as to why our people might not necessarily engage, or even putting it to the age-old excuse of, oh, we can't find anyone that culturally is suitable. And that's probably because we're looking into our own little networks. I often find that in my work, racism is denied, or the significance of it, you know, is actually denied. You know, I often find that, as tā Kim Workman was saying, you know, there's recruitment, and even recent recruitment that I've been, you know, either applied for or I've heard about, where the positions might be Māori and Pacific, but there's no one on that panel, you know, that is Māori Pacific, or there's a low number that have applied, and therefore saying, well, we've already advertised for that position. We didn't get many Pacifica people turning up. But then what we don't look at is we don't look at the mechanisms, okay, or the pathways that have been put in place for our Pacifica, for our Māori to be able to apply. And often I see this enough in many of the in the criminal justice organisations that I've worked with, where there is a Pacifica family or a Māori family, and we've got all these professionals involved, but there's no one with the cultural oversight. It's assumed that everyone already comes to the table with that, and there's no one actually being identified to prioritise that in their mahi. And that's the challenge, or it's offered, that cultural oversight is offered when it is available or when it is required. And the reality is that the question is, well, who's making that decision, you know, of when it's available or when it's required? Because often it's not the whānau, you know, that are making those decisions. So the reality for me is, why does this stuff still continue? Because tā Kim Workman spoke about it, and yet I see it even still now at the grassroots level. And I think it's a number of things. You know, it's that insecurity, you know, that exists. You know, we form a group, you know, it's dominant, and we alienate those that don't belong. But the reality is that if we were to become really anti-racist, we are going to upset people. And as human beings, we all don't like that, eh? We don't like that fear of not belonging, that fear of being different to the other. But to be anti-racist requires us all to look in the mirror. You know, it requires us to either look at those parts within ourselves that we have chosen to ignore, chosen to hide for decades. And I remember one non-Māori, non-Pacifica colleague who was in a key leadership role and saying to me, you know what, I think the best thing for me to do is to step aside so that I can, so that they will have somebody who is Māori with the same, with skills and experience, but actually does have that lived experience. And I thought, you know, that's what it does take. It takes somebody who is bold enough to step aside to ensure that actually Māori are leading the way, or that Pacifica are leading the way within their own cohort. I think another part, and this is, you know, that loss of humanity, that loss of compassion and empathy that can often have with those that we don't necessarily associate ourselves with, particularly if we're only associating with them within the criminal justice space, and we have this picture of who these communities are, and therefore we don't want to associate with them, or we think, oh yeah, no, that's you know, in the too hard basket, or even that fear. And often we know that when we are fearful of something, or we have issues against something, we tend to project it, you know. And I see that happen in meetings that I've been involved in, that that fear of losing control is then projected onto families. And often, if you think about those families that are coming into the criminal justice system, they are families who are already disconnected, who have already experienced the intergenerational transmission of trauma that Tak and Workman referred to. And then here we are as a system re-traumatizing our, you know, our families and so forth. And one of the things that I've always found is that we are all good to have those conversations about, you know, we need to address racism, we need to make sure that we are not influenced by our biases. But when it comes to the nitty-gritty, when we realize that there is going to be an opportunity where we're going to lose some of that power, or we're going to be guided by something that we haven't been trained in, or something that is a worldview that's very different from our own, then that's when it becomes too hard, you know, and things have stopped. And that's what I've seen, you know, in my mahi. And that's where I always come back to that point of relationships. You know, relationships is really key to being able to really to be able to minimize that risk of losing power, because it is about sharing it, and maybe even being in a position to hand over that power to the communities that you know is going to work best for their own people. But one of the biggest things that I do see is the silence, you know, is the silence where we actually just don't do anything. And we think that there's a need to be racist means you know, you've got to make those comments, you've got to say and behave in a certain way. But we don't need to be actively racist, you know, to support those racist systems, or to be racist. We can actually just sit there as part of a meeting and just watch the flowers grow and think, oh well, hey, that's not him, that's not my opinion, that's that person there, and therefore I'm not being racist. But the reality is we're perpetuating that. You know, we are maintaining those racist views. So I'm going to really, I wanted to really talk about just an example of some of the mahi that I have done. And this is a combination of different people that I have worked with, okay? And when they come into the criminal justice system, let's face it, a high percentage of them has first come through our care and protection systems. And that's the part that we don't really hear much about when they're in the CJ system. So let's talk about Charlie. Charlie's this baby, beautiful baby, you know, well loved, born in South Auckland, had a loving grandfather. Parents left him at an early age to be cared for by his koro. And we begin to already start to have some of our own ideas, you know, of what we think is going to happen to, you know, to Charlie. He's raised in an environment where typically in South Auckland, which is where I come from as well, which is filled with poverty. It's where the largest number of our Pacifica communities are raised, and there's a high rate of gangs, criminal activity, and so forth. And we notice that we don't see this. So this is Charlie as a baby, happy, everyone loves him, you know, everyone just wants to be around him. But very early on, we can see that the cracks are beginning to appear in terms of when he gets to school. So when he gets to school, okay, let's say, for example, what we're seeing is he's beginning to be learning issues. He's beginning to wag school. He's beginning to show some behavioural problems. And we're not actually quite sure of what's going on, but we assume that it's the, it's the family. But if we think about the systems and the processes and the policies, sorry, not the systems and the agencies that are available to the family, during those early formative years, well, what are they and how sustainable are they before they actually reach through to, to the child going to school? And what we actually see is these things happen in the school environment, and we call a whānau meeting. We call these whānau meetings, but where do we have them? We tend to have them at the school. We tend to make it more suitable to us as the professionals, but we don't think about accessibility, about the convenience. Are they during the day or are they after hours? We don't think about actually who's attending. And often I've been disheartened coming to these meetings where the large majority are all of us that are working with the family, the professionals, and there's only mum, with the young person, and we make biases and assumptions almost immediately. Then Charlie gets older and we think, okay, this is a care and protection issue, okay, because there's all these learning issues going on, there's this truancy, or we've got to get the care and protection services involved, and they go out and do a process. We have all these family group conferences, we undertake these interventions, and yet when we think about the interventions that are used, how culturally responsive are they? This is stuff that we already know. I'm just highlighting it again, but one of my real issues that I often have is that line NFA, no further action. When we can see that there's been a whole myriad of care and protection issues, but it's no further action because there was no evidence or there was no response or engagement from the family. So Charlie continues in his life, and then unsurprisingly turns up in the youth justice system. And by now, Charlie's dropped out of school. He's engaged in substance use, he's full on with his offending, and more than likely joined gangs. This time, the system we've responded with having all these reports done, and often these reports take a while, but these young people don't stand still, and neither do their families. We hold a whānau meeting. Again, we tell the whānau what the meeting is about, but we don't actually ask them what it should be about and what they need. And then we put in these cultural reports and these reports, and sometimes these reports are great, but how far do they go? I've often found that I've been asked to come in and do a report when there was a report a couple of years beforehand and the recommendations were not implemented. And I'm saying the same thing again in my report, and now it's cost the system more money, to be able to undertake that report. But again, what we're highlighting here is that it's just the same stuff, just on a different day. And that's the issue that I continue to see even now, which is really disappointing. Then we think, oh, let's put them in custody because they're not safe to be out in the community. But the reality is, we've created a pathway where we've made it not safe for them to be in the community. So this stuff we already know, and unsurprisingly, where's Charlie now? Inside, in the prison system. And what we know, when I've reflected, is that we've held all these countless whanos and huis, which were not representative nor inclusive of their worldviews. We've paid attention to the problem. We've focused on the behaviour, but we haven't looked at what were the injustices within the system, that led to this. We've said we've consulted, but when we look at who's consulted, it's been those that are not of the worldview, of these whānau or of these families. And then we've continued with our racist attitudes that I've seen, especially I've seen police, actually have a go at a young person, and say, well, you should have done this, you should have done that, and you should have been like this, but forgetting that actually there's a history of trauma that comes with these young people and this whānau that we haven't been educated on. By the way, I work very closely with police. I'm a critical friend of police. And I think that whilst they've done some really great work, we can all do more, in this space. And then again, it's that silence of just not doing anything, that has led to, our young people ending up in these prison cells, creating a breeding ground, for our gangs and so forth. So this is what I've seen. And the reality is, what we don't see is the blessing that I get to see when I'm doing therapy. And I wanted to just add this. This is something to remind us that when we are working in the criminal justice system for this racism, There is a person, there is a young person, there is a family that is involved. And this is a poem that was given to me by one of the young people who gave me consent to be able to share this. And I wanted to just share this with you now. Here goes my story. It's not great, but you can listen. I hope you take your time to hear me out before you end up skipping. When I was a kid, I nearly took my own life. I had a lot of ways with a rope or a knife. It's like I didn't know the reason why I used to get a hiding. It's just like now, I don't know why the fuck I'm hiding. I'm writing. I've been trying to find someone if they can hear me out. I've been looking and searching, but I still don't find no help. I can't read. You can read that, those lines in the beginning. I really hated those days. I guess all that stuff that happened through my years growing up, I guess that's what made me. So who gives a fuck? It's kind of hard to believe what I'm saying is true, but I'm only being honest because I only told you. I know we're here for a reason, but tell me what's mine. Was I here for a purpose, or is this a waste of time? You know, life is a game. You got to learn to play right, because one wrong mistake, remember, you've only got one life. What I would really like to see, for our young people is I want to see them achieving. I want us to be able to have that system of equity where when we have our whānaus and we have our huis, that they are led by the dominant worldview of the whānau and the communities that we serve, that we actually pay attention to the problem, but actually what's actually causing it. What are the systems and the structures in place that are causing and reinforcing it? Making sure that when we consult, we don't consult with people who have similar views to our own. We consult with those who are going to challenge us and actually make us feel uncomfortable. So we have those courageous conversations. And when we're feeling that fear and we're feeling that insecurity and that threat of losing power, think back to the fact that you might be dealing with that young person, you might be dealing with that adult, but how do we actually stop that pipeline of our people coming into the justice system right from the moment that they are born, and being able to share that power through trust, through trust and building the relationship. And finally, I think for me, it's not to remain silent, but to actually call it, even if we're not the ones that are actually saying it or behaving it in that certain way, being able to actually call it. And I leave you with this quote by James Baldwin: not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced. And rather than lifting the veil of silence, let's remove the veil of silence that exists by making sure that we prioritize equity in the mahi that we do. Ensure that when we are recruiting, that we provide proper and genuine pathways for our people to be actively recruited appropriately and culturally appropriately in safe ways for our communities, and making sure that we have those Indigenous worldviews embedded in the way in which we work with our mahi. Ngā
mihi. Whawhetai te a koe e te rangatira, e te koe e te maraikora Julia o tō kōrero I tēnei ata. Tēnā koe, tēnā koe, tēnā koe. Kōrua mā, look, we have a number of questions, and I can't say thank you both very much for your experiences, both on the ground, in the system, on the system, around the system. I cannot thank you both enough for your sharing this morning. Now, apparently all the comments and the questions will come to you, so you can see and perhaps be able to respond to those questions that I'm going to be unable to answer this morning. But I do want to go before we've got probably another 10 minutes before the end of the session. So if I could just ask, you start asking you both these questions, and I know they deserve a bigger, more in-depth response to them, but to try and get through what has been posed. And firstly, from Maringi Marsh, and it's just saying, do you think that our criminal justice system will be affected by the Aotearoa history curriculum being introduced into our kura. Ta, if you'd like to go first. You're on mute, Ta.
Kia ora. I would certainly like to believe that in, you know, the next 2 decades, those young people that are receiving that additional information will be much more ready to receive and talk about their history, the way, you know, the interface between the settlers and Māori, the whole issue of colonization, the impact of that on Indigenous, the Indigenous population. I have to say that the police have done a really excellent job, I think, of starting to address it. They have a thing called the Wall Walk, which features examples of racism and within the police and within New Zealand history. And so they study in some detail things like the overstayers' response to Dawn Rage, the incident at Rātoki and those sorts of examples. But it's still only very sparse, and what seems to be needed is a more detailed conversation, I guess, a difficult conversation between those people that have been impacted by that and the police themselves.
Sure.
And I think
I think that's exactly what Julia was talking towards the end of her presentation.
Yeah.
Thank you, Ta, and again acknowledge that these questions, you know, require more in depth, but want to get through a couple. I'm just going to put this one to you, Julia, please. It's from Miriana Tupere, and saying, kia ora, Ta Kim, rawa ko Julia. Pleasure to listen to you both today. Julia, for your response, please. Is a non-racist criminal justice system possible in New Zealand? There's a couple in here. And how do you think Māori restoration practices exist in the system, if at all? Finally, to the both, that second one, would in your opinion, that be appropriate? This criminal justice system, is it possible?
Yes.
So yes, I'll answer that first part, because I think the second part of that question, obviously, for rangatira. But look, I'm an optimist, and I'm always hopeful, okay, that we can achieve that. But to do that really requires us to dig deep within ourselves as people, and actually share some of that power, actually get into a space where we don't know what's going on, but we trust that system, or we trust, you know, the members of our Indigenous community, that they will lead the way. And that's the hard part, is despite us having a system, people belong to that system. And it is people that make those decisions. And so I think I always, and this is probably me as a psychologist, I always go back to those values. Well, what are the values that embed the way in which we work? What are the values that embed the structures that we have, developed for us? But again, you know, I think absolutely we can, but it requires us to have those courageous and those brave conversations.
Kia ora. Hāpai. Hāpai, thank you. You,
yeah,
you want to add to that?
Yes, I do. At the moment, Commissioner Costa, a year ago, decided that he was going to research the level of bias within the prison system, within the police system, and set up a project, understanding policing delivery, to look at the perceived, the problems of bias and systemic racism within the police organisation. And I was favoured to be appointed as the chair of the independent panel, because one of the things we discussed was that you have to have difficult conversations to get through this. And so the panel that I chair, there's 10 people like Rahui Papa, Lady Tiriti Moxon, Kylie Quince, Professor Spoonley, Helen Lay, and others, have been mandated to challenge the research as it proceeds, to challenge any of the results. In fact, it now ended up managing the research itself, and that will start in a few months. And I think that willingness, I think it's the first time a chief executive of a public sector organisation has stopped just, usually they read the reports and then shelve them and don't do anything with the recommendations. He's doing something different. And I think it's beholden to us. It's going to be difficult. There'll be opposition. The people that are listening, I'll just implore you to support what he's trying to do. The second thing, Lisa, is about restorative justice, and particularly Māori restorative justice. I think there's a real gap in the system because corrections have not supported the holding of restorative justice conferences after a person has been sentenced to prison. There's been and they stopped doing that in 2009. We were doing those conferences. There were two things that came out. One was that more Māori prisoners were wanting to have that. 80% of the requests we got were from Māori, and they had no problems with involving whānau and so forth. I don't think we've developed what I would call a Māori restorative approach yet, because we've never been given the opportunity.
Kia ora, Hāpai.
Can I just add one more thing to that, Lisa, just really quickly, because I sit within police in the Pacifica Advisory Group to the Commissioner, and when the group that was being formed, that Kim Workman has just referred to, the Commissioner made it really clear to us that it was independent and he had no involvement in terms of choosing who was going to be on it and so forth, which highlighted to us, just the genuine, the authentic approach that police were undertaking to be able to do that with integrity. And an example for that is the Pacific Police Strategy was launched in 2017, 2018, first time ever that there's been a Pacific strategy within police. It took 2 years for that to actually happen. And the reason for that is because it was co-authored, co-written approach with the Pacifica community, and we had to have those courageous conversations, and it took a while, but we got there in the end. And I think that's the sort of processes that needs to happen more, is that working together in partnership, all of community, by all of government approach to working for our people.
Hāpai. Ngā mihi atu. Look, I don't know whether we're just going to get cut off in this session because it is coming up towards the end. Just to let you both know that there have been 17 other questions asked of you both. That is in the question and answer. I do hope that you're able to answer those for those folk who have taken time to place them there. We've just run out of time to do it live. But finally, to say, ngā mihi atu kia kōrua. Ngā mihi atu ki ngā whānau I tai mai I tēnei ata, I te whakarongo ki tēnā kaupapa. You've had 209 folk listen to you both this morning, and as many comments being put in the chat, and like I've already mentioned, the number of questions that have come through to you. Final word, Julia, before we hand to Ka to close our session.
just to say thank you very much for the opportunity to kōrero and talanoa with you today and to be sitting alongside Tākam Workman. Thank you, Lisa, for leading our talanoa, our kōrero for today, and just for all of us. Look after each other. It's not easy, the work that we do, but then we wouldn't do it anyway if it was.
Kia ora. Tā.
Kia ora, Lisa, and thank you so much. I enjoyed the conversation. We've got some mahi to do. I perhaps should acknowledge also Whaia Linda Smith. I did her master's paper in November of this year to try to get myself upgraded, so I knew more about what I was supposed to be talking about, and just want to acknowledge her. I'm really enjoying the panel and the work that we're doing. So could I close with a karakia for us?
Yes, please, tā. Ngā mihi.
Ai. Kia taunga manakitanga a te mea ngaro. Ki runga ki tēnā o tātou. Kia mahue i te hua mākihikihi. Kia toi te kupu, toi te mana, toi te reo, toi te aroha, ka whakamāua kia tīna.
Tīna.
Ue tai.
Ai, ki e. Ngā mihi atu kia koutou, kia tātou katoa, ngā manakitanga o te atua kia tātou i tēnei wā. Mauri ora.